ready to go.
Oh, okay. Yes, indeed.
I just want to ask, Dr. Bird, can you, seeing us, is this loud and clear and so on your end?
Yes, thank you very much.
All right, it's yours. Go ahead. It's a pleasure.
All right. Thank you for allowing me to speak briefly. Could we start the slides, please? I'm Peter Bird, appearing in the capacity as a consultant to the Mothers for Peace.
Right, you got his presentation.
Just 1 second, Dr. Bird, we're working on getting your slides up.
Well, I can introduce the first one. My first objective this afternoon is to summarize and clarify the filings that I've provided previously, because there are about 6 of them. And also they're developing 2 different themes, which are nevertheless related. The first being that the 2015 seismic source characterization was deficient and biased. Yes, there we go. And the second being an independent estimate of the seismic hazard at Diablo Canyon. So this point of my presentation is a review, and I apologize to those who may have read this more than once. But the first criticism of the 2015 seismic source characterization is that no deformation modeling was performed. And because of that, we don't know that the fault slip rates that they used are consistent with geodesy. No one has ever looked at how the fault slip rates in the Irish Hills relate to changes in slip rate along the trace of the Hosgri Fault. And perhaps most importantly, because there was no deformation model, there's no estimate of the distributed strain or cryptic strain that is not occurring on the modeled faults, but is necessary for kinematic self-consistency. And that's really important, because that distributed strain tends to express itself as earthquakes, and sometimes very large earthquakes. And that's a great deficiency of the report. The second great deficiency is that when they attempted to account for unmapped faults in their local area source model, they mischaracterized the seismic moment rate of that whole set of virtual faults by simply assuming that they would continue to produce seismic moment rate as at the same rate as microseismicity in the last several decades. This is absolutely the wrong way to do things. If you applied this to the San Andreas Fault, you'd get a totally misleading answer that it's absolutely safe to live on. What they should have done is taken the distributed deformation rate within that zone and converted it to seismic moment rate using a global calibration, which I and others have produced over the last 20 years. And third, the criticism was that there have been several proposals and arguments for a thrust fault at shallow depth under Diablo Canyon with a high slip rate, but no such source was included. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so this slide is based on a publication from PG&E 2015, and I've added the dashed red line, which I call the inferred coastline thrust fault. In the tradition of geologic maps, it's long dashed because it's poorly exposed but well located. It's located first by the topography of the Irish Hills, second by the uplift map for the Irish Hills, which has a discontinuity there, and third by the folding in the older, say, late Miocene, early Pliocene sedimentary rocks of the Irish Hills. Now, what about the poorly exposed? It might actually be exposed, but mislabeled as shoreline fault, because I'm very aware of an analog in the south side of the Santa Monica Mountains. I'm leading a GSA field trip there in September, called the Malibu Coast Fault, which is both strike slip and a thrust, and it has been so consistently for the last 6 million years. The other possibility, of course, is that this inferred coastline thrust fault is a blind thrust fault, which is expressed as a very large fold near the surface. Okay, next slide, please. Now, in the 2024 update of the seismic source characterization, PG&E attempted to refute these criticisms in their new Chapter 6. However, their attempts to refute them were full of elementary logical errors and misunderstandings. Basically, they failed. I provided a full rebuttal to the Independent Safety Committee in a memo of 8 May 2024, and I continue to stand by these original objections. So that was my first theme developed in several documents. A new theme became available after the Noto Peninsula earthquake of January 1st, which was a very serious earthquake, a terrible catastrophe for the Japanese people who had to live through it, and I guess about 60 people didn't live through it. But it's rather a gift to California because it shows us what we can expect in our future in the California coast ranges. There is an exactly analogous geologic situation where a small block of crust is being uplifted between two conjugate thrust faults, which are poorly exposed because they're under the water. And that earthquake simplifies our considerations because it had shaking that was so very strong, peak ground acceleration of 1 to 2.3 G at 5 modern strong motion instruments, that we can be virtually certain that earthquake would have caused seismic core damage at Diablo Canyon if Diablo Canyon had been in the same range of hills. So the critical question is, if we consider this a characteristic earthquake that we have to guard against, how often will it occur? And I found 3 different simple ways to estimate the total slip rate on all the gently dipping thrust faults under the Irish Hills, with a result of 2 to 2.8 millimeters per year. Let me just briefly mention the first, the isostatic method. Since we know the Irish Hills are being uplifted at about 0.2 millimeters per year, and since we know that the Irish Hills are isostatically overcompensated, it follows that the rate of crustal thickening in the Irish Hills is about 6 times greater, or 1.2 millimeters per year. And the rate of thrust faulting has to be calculated from the rate of crustal thickening, not the rate of surface uplift. So here's a case where PG&E got it wrong by a factor of 6. Anyway, knowing the total rate of thrust faulting on all the thrust faults under the Irish Hills, whether they're dipping north, dipping south, or internal, you can convert that to a recurrence interval of about 715 years for Noto-type earthquakes just by knowing the mean slip in the Noto Peninsula earthquake, which was 2 meters or 2,000 millimeters. So this was the basis for my March 4th declaration to NRC, documenting that the seismic core damage frequency at Diablo Canyon is about 1.4 times 10 to the minus 3 per year, not 3 times 10 to the minus 5th per year, as PG&E has claimed. This is an increased risk by a factor of 47. And this contention became the basis for an emergency shutdown petition by the Mothers for Peace, the Environmental Working Group, and Friends of the Earth, which is still being considered in NRC. I have to tell you, since several of you have mentioned the meeting that was scheduled for next Tuesday, that meeting has now been postponed due to NRC's concerns to July 17th or 18th. I would have been glad to get this done, but that's still ahead.
That postponement is news to us, and thank you, because we
yes, well, it was
mentioned that it was scheduled for next Tuesday. But so you're telling, let me just say that it's been postponed to either the 17th or the 18th of July, and that was
yes, those are tentative dates.
That's fine, and we'll hear from the NRC about that.
Yes.
Now, just to tell everybody, any member of the public can tune into that. It's just simply a question of knowing the date and going to the website. Okay.
And Dr. Bird, what was the reason for the delay? What was the reason for the postponement?
They said one reason was availability of staff. That is, I guess they have some people on vacation. The other reason was that we submitted a supplementary declaration addressing their concerns in their initial assessment and attempting to show that they're just due to misconceptions, which misconceptions have their origin in the 2015 SSC from PG&E.
Okay, thank you.
So let's go to the last slide. This is a new topic. This is something that's been bothering me a great deal in the last few weeks. And I want to ask the question without expecting an answer today, but I want to raise the question among the whole group. And it relates to the recent updated SSC report by PG&E. My question is, where is the update of the GPS geodetic program? In 2015, they reported preliminary results from GPS sites at Diablo Canyon and surrounding locations, which were good enough to show that the shortening direction in the Irish Hills is north 15 east. And they reported that in their 2015 SSC without mentioning what the shortening rate actually is. Well, it may have been preliminary at that time. However, after 10 to 13 more years of data collection, it should be possible now to provide a highly accurate value for the horizontal crustal shortening rate across the Irish Hills. And this number is one of the most important for determining the seismic hazard at Diablo Canyon due to thrust faulting. And according to my arguments, the thrust faulting seismic hazard at Diablo Canyon is much greater than the hazard from the Hosbury Fault. Therefore, it should receive the focus of our attention and research. Now, I don't have the clout to get an answer to this question, but perhaps some members of the committee do, and I hope they will pursue it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bird.
Sorry. About 60 seconds ago, I went to the NRC website. It's on the schedule for July 17th at 3 p.m. Eastern, which is noon in California. I'll read it to you. The purpose of this meeting is for the petitioners to clarify the March 4th petition regarding the seismically initiated severe accident in Diablo Canyon. Okay, so your 17th to 18th is now on the schedule as the 17th. That doesn't mean it won't change later, but I thought I'd tell you that. Okay?
Thank you.
It's right here on the website.
Okay, great.
By the way, with a contact human person to contact if you needed to call, there's a name there. That's the same fellow, Perry Buckberg, that we had dealt with before. Okay.
Right. Now,
glad to clarify.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Bundes. Let us now entertain comments from the committee's bench on Professor Bird's presentation before we entertain public comments.
Chairman, I have a question.
We're not going to be able to hear that, Sherry. We cannot hear him.
We cannot hear you. Come to the podium, please.
We can't hear him in the back of the room.
Right.
Before you folks talk, could you have the two scientists ask him some questions?
Well, we're going to ask them to ask them.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
That's for us to do.
Before other people,
That's for
before
us to
you
do.
or we come in.
Yeah. That's for us to do.
Yes,
Thank you.
yes. We certainly consider that request,
I
Ms.
was-
Lewis.
Go ahead.
Right. Now, as the order of business here is, we are entertaining comments from the committee's bench. Now, Ms. Lewis' suggestion will be taken very seriously. Later on, we will ask the two geologists, specialists, to interact with Dr. Peter
Well,
Bird.
I mean, don't mind.
Dr. Kadak?
All we can do is ask questions.
Dr. Kadak, you had a question.
One of your key points, I think, in your theory is to say that this Noto Peninsula earthquake is similar to what might occur here at the Irish Hills. Can you defend that a little bit better than just that one bullet?
Rick, Andy, before he intervenes, we have a submittal from him with some detail about that. But
Right.
You can go on and say it here. Go ahead, Dr. Bird, but we already have a submittal with some of that.
Right,
Go ahead.
it's, Dr. Kadak, it's on our record. Yeah,
But go ahead,
needs to know.
Peter Bird, answer the question if you can.
Yes.
Well, this was one of the concerns of the PRB at NRC, and they pointed out that the rupture at Noto Peninsula or offshore was longer, and therefore the magnitude was higher than we might be able to fit into the fault system of the Irish Hills. Now, that's a valid point. However, I would strongly hold that if this earthquake is the major threat to Diablo Canyon, it deserves a more serious treatment than just calculating a magnitude and plugging it into a ground motion prediction equation. What an adequate SSC for the plant would do is take the actual seismograms from Noto Peninsula, which are very high quality records. And if the magnitude is found to be too large, all you have to do is truncate the source after an appropriate number of seconds. But as a seismologist, I feel strongly that that will have very little result on the peak ground motion, which comes from the part of fault closest to or underneath the seismometer.
I guess, is it geologically a similar situation as occurred in Japan, is what I'm really trying to get at.
Well, it's a pop-up between two conjugate thrust faults. I'm not claiming that every aspect of the geologic history is parallel.
Thank you.
Dr. Bennett, would you like to accommodate Ms. Lewis' request?
Yeah, it's a simple comment, and that is that in the fact-finding report, which is before us and which I summarized, earlier, I said in plain English, speaking for the committee, that Dr. Bird's claiming that Noto Peninsula earthquake in Japan has sufficient analogous properties to be similar here, that we haven't had the opportunity either to review that or to see anybody else's review of it yet. That's okay, someone will review it soon. And there's no way on earth that any of us is an expert on the tectonic regime or the geology of the Noto Peninsula in northern Japan, I mean, that's a sort of a narrow thing. So we are awaiting, DCISC, or at least I am, some evaluation by others who can either say, yeah, that analogy is valid or partially or what, depending on what they know, which I don't know. I mean, that's just the best way to say it. Now, I don't mind turning the table right over here to Gordon Seitz and to.
Yes, I thought that was exactly Ms. Lewis'
Phil
request.
Johnson just asked.
Right,
You
right.
already said that you hadn't looked at it in detail yet, but do you have any comment about that, or is that something that will be looked at later? Or,
Right, so I thought this is exactly
Any
what Ms.
comment about
Lewis
that,
requested.
Gordon?
Yeah, Dr. Seitz and your fellow speaker, would you please, if
You gotta use the mic 'cause there are people
if it's
out in the-
appropriate and if feasible, and if you are willing and able to do that, Ms. Lewis is requesting
ask him the
perhaps you
question.
gentlemen would ask Professor Bird some questions.
Yeah, I have a couple questions. One is, you mentioned that the uplift of the terraces is not, or uplift rate in general of the markers that were used up until now are not representative of crustal thickening because they're not considering I guess crustal thickening under the Irish Hills. Is that the claim?
Yes, so essentially the analogy that PG&E is making is that the Irish Hills are an elevator cab made of stainless steel, completely rigid. It rises, the top of the crust rises the same amount as the bottom of the crust, and there's a little friction on the side, which is expressed as thrust faulting on the Los Osos and the San Luis Bay fault system. However, you can demolish that model very easily. If you have a flat rug laid in the floor of an elevator on the ground floor, when the elevator gets to the second floor, that rug is still lying flat. Not so for the late Miocene and Pliocene sedimentary rocks of the Irish Hills, which are folded into the Pismos syncline and many other folds with 90-degree angles and 45-degree dips. Therefore, the Irish Hills have not been rising as a rigid block. That means there are probably other thrust faults involved. Another good reason to expect that other thrust faults are involved is that the basement is Franciscan complex, which is essentially made of thrust faults. The Franciscan having been scraped off the subducting Farallon plate back in Cretaceous and early Tertiary time and slowly accreted. All of those old thrust faults are still there and available for reactivation.
Dr. Bird, I just want to ask a question before Gordon jumps in. I tried to study this as best I could, I saw there's sort of an analogy to area isostasy, in which it's sort of like, you know, when an iceberg floats and you add mass to the iceberg, it doesn't just respond linearly. There's a relationship because it's 1/7 is above and 6/7 is below. And that sort of isostatic area phenomenon is different than what you said could be. It's a block of steel that just goes all by itself. And I think that, as I understood it, but I'm not an expert, and I'll ask Gordon or perhaps Phil to comment also. The question, in part, is whether or not those formations actually behave that way. I mean, that's a piece of the important part of how this responds over time. I have that right?
That's part of my question. The other question is, what observation do we have that the crustal thickness is greater underneath the Irish Hills?
That's part of it. That's related part.
Right. Are you using gravity, or what kind of data are you using, Peter?
I'm not using my data. I'm using the data kindly provided by PG&E in Chapter 6 of their 2024 update, where they discuss a very nice isostatic gravity map, which shows that the Irish Hills are not just isostatically compensated, they're overcompensated. That is to say, if somehow we could stop plate tectonics and stop all the faults slipping, then they would rise about another 200 meters in the future. So actually, when I use the area isostasy model as a basis for calculation, I'm actually underestimating the rate of crustal thickening.
Okay. Have you looked at the Casmalia fault study for implications for the Irish Hill uplift?
Unfortunately not.
Okay.
Peter Bird, let me play that back to you. You said even if you turned off the plate tectonics, you say this phenomenon would continue for over a very long time, as much as a couple hundred meters. So therefore, it has actually, in your view, been underestimated, huh?
Well, the main underestimation is the factor of 6 that divides the uplift rate and the crustal thickening rate.
Right.
But I was saying, in addition, that maybe it's not a factor of 6, maybe it's a factor of 8. Hypothetically.
And that was that underestimation I just mentioned.
Yeah, the difficulty with being more precise is that we don't actually know how this isostatic gravity anomaly has developed through time. We can only observe it today. So we don't know how old it is.
Thank you. You have any more, Gordon?
Dr. Seiss?
Phil, you have any comments about any of that? I don't want to put you on the spot, but here you are.
Now, the shoreline fault, we know is a vertical fault and strike slip at the surface. So this inferred thrust fault would be located in your model between the shoreline fault and the plant? I mean, that's where it would daylight, or are you saying it's a blind thrust?
I accept that there is a vertical and probably strike slip shoreline fault. There's a lot of good evidence for that. Although there's a little mystery as to how it could be active when it's at right angles to the direction of compressive stress, shown by both the world stress map and by the GPS analysis I mentioned a few minutes ago. But I accept that it's there. However, it's entirely possible that a thrust fault is confused with the trace of the shoreline fault and that they haven't been adequately separated. Alternatively, the inferred coastline fault could be a blind thrust that surfaces in a fold in the late Miocene, Pliocene sedimentary rocks.
Now, there's another piece of data, I guess, is the focal mechanisms on the shoreline fault are strike slip.
That's true.
And that's hard to dismiss because they also position the fault plane where it is and where it was found at the surface.
Well, if we're going to talk about focal mechanisms, we have to remember these are very small earthquakes.
Yes.
But there were 2 thrust earthquakes under the Irish Hills recently, and one was December 27th of last year, and one was January 1st, almost in sympathy to the Noto Peninsula earthquake.
Right, but they're not low angle, but they, yeah. And I think PG&E did commented on those in the update. But we'll have to look at that again.
Okay.
Well, I have to give PG&E credit for noticing and commenting on all kinds of data. My criticism is that when they come to create their fault geometry models, they don't actually use that information.